Warcraft's story used to have teeth. It felt complex, filled with characters whose motives were layered and whose histories partially remained obscured. It was dark, it was mysterious, and it was very cool. These days, it far too often feels like the writers are terrified that we might misunderstand any part of the story. Every character's motivations, every villain's agenda, and every emotional beat is explained to an almost dumbfounding degree. Entire story arcs feel as though they were written for a high school English project. No nuance, no depth, just an over-sanitized mess. And lo and behold, many of the core characters within the Warcraft universe have lost their luster along with this. This falls well outside my usual competitive Mythic Plus content, but it is something that I care very deeply about. Today, I want to discuss where I believe World of Warcraft's narrative direction has taken a wrong turn, and what needs to change if Blizzard is ever going to give Warcraft its grit back again. Why do I even care about WoW's narrative? Hell, why should this matter to anyone other than the massive lore nerds? The thing is, from the beginning of Warcraft to the present day, I don't think that the gameplay alone was ever the primary driver of its success. Instead, I think the immersive world that the gameplay occurred within was part of it. I am currently a multi-0.1% title level Mythic Plus player. I spend the majority of my time hyper-optimizing and engaging almost exclusively with dungeon content. And while I love the game mode itself, one of the biggest things that gives it meaning is the world that Mythic Plus belongs to. If I wanted to run dungeons and nothing else, I would go play Fellowship or something, but I don't. In fact, I genuinely could not care less about that game. The true beauty of WoW is that my accomplishments exist within a persistent fantasy world. The dungeon is not just a collection of mechanics and enemies, it is a place within Azeroth. So when that world begins changing from a deep and engaging fantasy setting to an over-sanitized and quite frankly childish narrative mess, it upsets me. I want to give Blizzard the benefit of the doubt. I want to believe that they are attempting to dig us out of some narrative rut that it's been trapped in for years, but some of the writing lately has been absolutely asinine. Some people will hear this criticism and assume that I'm complaining about the politics of modern Warcraft. I'm not. Honestly, I don't give a fuck about that debate, and I'm not interested in turning this video into that. What bothers me though is Blizzard's increasing refusal to leave anything beneath the surface of the story. The most compelling characters in fantasy are rarely the ones who have every motivation and emotion and piece of their history explicitly explained to the audience. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd, and I think Sauron demonstrates this perfectly. Within the central story of Lord of the Rings, he is presented as an ancient and overwhelming power, concealed in shadow, capable of corrupting the will of others and consumed by a desire to dominate all of Middle-earth. But for those who choose to dig deeper, there is an enormous amount of history behind him. Sauron was originally a Maiar with an intense fixation on order and a hatred of chaos that made him vulnerable to corruption from the first Dark Lord Morgoth, and gradually transformed his desire from one of wanting to organize the world into a desire to completely control it. The important thing is that the main story doesn't stop and explain all of that to us. The depth exists, but it's not forced down our throat. And Sauron is not morally ambiguous either. He is fundamentally evil. A villain can be unmistakably evil and still feel layered. Warcraft's most memorable characters have historically worked in similar ways. Illidan, Arthas, Garrosh, Deathwing, the Old Gods, they all carried histories and motivations and contradictions that were not constantly verbalized. Not every element of their character was neatly explained, and that gave a sense of mystique. We were allowed to interpret them for ourselves. Modern WoW far too often does the opposite. Every motivation is explained. Every emotion is labeled. Every moral dilemma arrives with a correct interpretation that's attached to it. Rather than allowing emotion to emerge through performance, the story will brute force it until there is nothing left for the audience to discover. That is why I think the original War Within cinematic was so acclaimed compared to the Midnight one. In it, Anduin's pain didn't need to be explained. You could see it in his face, you could hear it in his voice, you could feel it through the music. The story trusted that the audience would be able to understand without having it spelled out to them. That sort of subtlety is what Warcraft really needs to get back. And this doesn't just infect the broad stories as well. The writing within each scene has been a complete mess on this front as well. I could forgive some narrative discrepancies if Blizzard was building towards some sort of broader story arc, but there is no reason the dialogue within the stories at the moment needs to be so childishly and aggressively over-explained. Circling back to Anduin, there was a genuinely interesting moment in early War Within where he admits that, while dominated, part of him enjoyed causing pain and suffering to others. That is a really uncomfortable confession. It raises questions about guilt or agency, or whether domination only controlled his actions and exposed him to a side of himself that he didn't want to confront. And yet, that scene barely allowed any of that to exist before Faerun interjects with a lesson about mistakes and doubts not making him unworthy, and instead helping guide him forward. Anduin's like surprised and thoughtful, as though the moral framing hadn't occurred to him at any point. The issue isn't that he was comforted in the first place. The issue is that Blizzard introduced a difficult moral dilemma and then immediately told us how we should interpret it. A moment that could have carried genuine emotional depth was diffused before it had any room to breathe. I think a famous example as well is when the Aspects regained their power at the end of Yggdrasil. Kalecgos comes together and states that we did it as a family, after which all of the other characters come together and start restating the same thing, that they united and they became whole and discovered that it was their shared cause that mattered more. This was all done instead of allowing the events themselves to demonstrate that theme. Blizzard instead placed it on a platter in front of the player, complete with complimentary pacifier and juice box, as though the audience was too stupid or childish to come to an independent conclusion. Returning to Tolkien's depictions of Sauron, at no point does he stand in front of the audience and announce that his obsession with order has become an obsession with control and domination. The story allows that to emerge throughout his history, his actions, and how he is depicted on the screen. Modern Warcraft writing would have Sauron stand in front of Mount Doom and explain exactly what the ring symbolizes or something like that. And that same lack of narrative restraint extends beyond just the dialogue and goes to how Blizzard actually frames the player. Blizzard needs to stop treating the player like the hero of Azeroth, or the champion, or the Maw-Walker, or whatever variation or title is being carried that week. This style of framing simply does not work in a multiplayer game. I am not saying that every single player needs to become an unknown peasant, but the moment that the narrative began centering us as a pivotal character is the moment that the world itself began to feel smaller. I understand that this is a hole that the writing team has dug themselves over many years, and to be fair, I think they've improved somewhat on this front recently. But one of the main allures of Warcraft early on was that you were simply a denizen of the world. The entire story did not hinge upon us. We still mattered, like we fought in battles and we defeated some powerful enemies and we did influence the course of events, but we weren't a critical cog in the wheel. We were simply taking part in events that were much larger than ourselves. You contrast this with modern WoW, where every story is built around us. You are the brave and uniquely important hero. My level 90 Shadow Priest, which was created 2 days ago, is suddenly the savior of the entire world and personally trusted by every faction leader, and apparently the only person capable of saving Azeroth from the latest cosmic threat. It reminds me of why in Dungeons & Dragons, groups will often retire or reset their characters once they've reached a certain high level. At a certain point, the escalating power and importance of your character creates like a narrative power creep that is so extreme that the world doesn't really feel grounded anymore. Every new threat has to be bigger, every achievement has to be more impossible, like every character has to be more uniquely important than they were before. This is exactly what has happened to Warcraft over the years. We no longer feel like adventurers participating in the history of Azeroth. We feel like an axis that the world revolves around. Blizzard, we do not want to be the main characters. Stop treating us like we are. I do want to give the writers the benefit of the doubt here. Bellular recently made a couple of really good videos arguing that the World Soul Saga may function as something of like a narrative cleanse, like tying off decades of loose ends and creating space for Warcraft's story to move in a new direction. So maybe what we're seeing is Blizzard attempting the almost impossible task of neatly resolving storylines that are spread across nearly 3 decades of lore. Perhaps some of the awkwardness is unavoidable, but that only explains the direction of the plot. It doesn't excuse the way that individual scenes are written. Even if Blizzard is trying to resolve decades of accumulated lore, the dialogue doesn't need to treat the player like a child. Characters don't need to explain every emotion and every theme and every moral resolution as though the audience is completely incapable of thinking for themselves. That's what concerns me the most. This is no longer an occasionally poorly written scene. It increasingly feels like a defining feature of Warcraft's modern narrative style. And no matter how cool or compelling the broader story becomes, even after this hypothetical reset, it will still fall flat if every meaningful moment is immediately explained and sanitized beyond recognition. Because the narrative immersion of the game is not some irrelevant bonus for lore nerds. It is a massive part of Warcraft's future success. I want Azeroth to remain a thriving world that I am still living in and competing within 20 years from now. But if Blizzard doesn't trust the audience in their interpretation of the story, or just trust that the world itself will carry the meaning, WoW may just continue functioning as a game, while gradually becoming a hollow shell of what made it so good in the first place. Do I think that my ramblings will have any actual impact on the direction of the game itself? Probably not. I'm just a passionate nerd with a YouTube channel. But maybe if people make enough noise, Blizzard will eventually recognize the mistakes that they have been making in their narrative design and character dialogue for years now. Warcraft doesn't need to become relentlessly dark. It doesn't need more blood or misery or moral ambiguity or anything like that. It simply needs to trust the audience again and trust the world itself to convey messages. Let moments breathe. Let characters have some mystery. Let the world feel larger than the player that's inhabiting it. A special thanks to all those who support the channel, including the Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yulem, Is This Real, and Obold the Orc at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as all those who appear on the end screen. We'll be back to our regular Mythic Plus content in the next video. Otherwise, thank you for hanging out until the end. Until next time, gamers, take care.